Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Leslie Cormack, and I'm the Principal and Deputy Vice Chancellor here at UBC Okanagan campus. And I'm one of the executive sponsors of the development of an Indigenous citizenship policy at UBC. I'm joining you today from the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. For our Vancouver colleagues, I'd like to acknowledge the Point Grey campus is located on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. As we embark on the development of an Indigenous citizenship policy at UBC, today's webinar will also mark the start of an Indigenous citizenship speaker series. The speaker series will provide an important opportunity for learning, reflection, and conversation across our entire institution. I'm really honored today to welcome and introduce our inaugural speaker series guest, Dr. Kim TallBear, whose talk today is Indigenous Self-Identification and Beyond, History, Cases, Policy Change. Dr. TallBear is a citizen of the Sisseton Waipiton Oyate, a Dakota nation in present-day South Dakota. She's a professor in the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin City campus. The state of Minnesota sits within the homelands of the Dakota and the Ojibwe people. 7 Ojibwe reservations and 4 Dakota communities constitute the state's 11 federally recognized tribes. She's also the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. Dr. TallBear is the co-founder of the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING, Canada. She's advised the president of the American Society of Human Genetics on issues related to genomics and Indigenous peoples. And she's also advised museums on exhibits related to race and science. I also do need to say that she and I were colleagues for a number of years at the University of Alberta, where she had a CRC in the Faculty of Native Studies. And so I'm delighted to see Kim here and to welcome her virtually to UBC and hear what she has to say. So welcome, Kim. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Leslie. I assume my title slide is up, and if it is, we can go to the next slide. I can't see the slides.
Sorry, just one moment. Just doing
No
some
worries.
technical things.
No worries. I appreciate you running them remotely for me. We can go to the title slide first then. Yep, that's just the title, and now we can move on to the second one. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote by somebody, all or most of you in the audience will know the late Murray Sinclair. When he was affiliated with Queen's University in 2021, he said, "It is clear that self-identification of indigeneity no longer works. Self-declaration is an important part, but it is just the beginning. We must go beyond an honor system and include voices from Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. Queen's and all universities must work in allyship to build better processes that honor Indigenous self-determination, practices, and approaches." This was a pretty important statement when he made it in 2021. I learned while spending 10 years in Canada that the tenet of self-identification was really important to people, to a lot of Indigenous people across the country, precisely because of how federal Indian status and federal Indian law in Canada had usurped the ability of Indigenous nations to define themselves. And so this was a real turning point where Indigenous peoples in Canada had to really think about the problems with self-identification alone. So that's the significance of this statement. And many of you in the audience may know that better than I do. Let's go to the next slide. Yep, that's the right one. Okay, so why not identity? Before I get into the case studies and more of the historical weeds of how we got to here, I just want to problematize this word identity. And it's something that I have started to do a lot in the last 5 years in my own work. I have a long record of researching the intersections of race and indigeneity, or race and tribe, as we call it in the United States, precisely because I was looking at the application of DNA testing to Indigenous identity claims, to ancestry, and to tribal enrollment and First Nations citizenship in Canada. And so I've thought a lot about this word identity, and I think it's actually quite a problem. And I want us to dispense with the presumption that an individual's identity is the best way to understand the stakes for Indigenous peoples in this conversation about self-indigenization. I understand that it's a word that we can't help but use. It's a very common word in the English language and in this very individualistic society that we live in. But I would just like people to remember, when they invoke that word, that may not often be what we are really talking about. So settler society has made this problem of self-indigenization, or pretendianism, as it's more colloquially called, a problem of identity. But identity is something that gets invoked to think about an individual right or a property. Again, it is very individualistic. The word can mean everything and nothing simultaneously. For example, it's often used to refer to settler state taxpayer identification, or ID cards that permit individuals to operate a motor vehicle or to cross international borders. Identity is a term that can be used to describe or refer to an individual's racial or sexual orientation, their gender, their descriptions of disability or ability. Now, I don't study those kinds of identities, quote unquote, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Identity is a misnomer, though, I think, for what we are actually talking about in this conversation of self-indigenization. And when we are making statements about who we are as First Peoples, capital P, as peoples, we are configured in dynamic, ongoing relations among our peoples and with our home territories. Who are the people and peoples that we recognize, relate with, claim, and who claim, recognize, and relate with us? We are concerned with belonging to our nations and our peoples as collectives. So we're much more concerned with a sense of collective belonging. And I do think it has settler discourse and conversations and ideas that have really forced upon us this notion that what we are dealing with is primarily about individual identity. In fact, it may be about individual identity for those who make false or exaggerated claims. But I want to remind us that as Indigenous peoples, this is more about the collective. So whenever possible, can we resist using that concept of identity, right? Can we, for example, if we're talking about people who were scooped, for example, or forcibly adopted, can we, instead of talking about how they might have lost their identity or lost their culture, can we think more about the kind of harm that was done to them as a relative among a collective, right? What was taken from them, and versus what was lost as an individual. It's really a separation of them from the collective. And so I think we need to think a little bit more in a little bit more complicated terms when we use that word, and maybe try to find other ways to discuss these problems. So let's go to the next slide. So this is Cheryl Harris, who's a professor of law at UCLA, and anybody who has studied race and whiteness is probably familiar with this very important 1993 Harvard Law Review article that I cite here. She is widely cited, not only by critical race scholars who are Black Americans, but also by Indigenous scholars who think about race and indigeneity. And one of the main insights that Cheryl Harris had is that in the US legal system, and I leave it to legal scholars in the audience to think about this application in Canada, but this works really well for the kinds of intersections of race and indigeneity that I've studied in Canada as well. Harris says that property and race have developed strong links, and that whiteness as a concept has become a valued form of property that accords those who possess it rights and privileges that the legal system defends. Whiteness doesn't mean anything if you can't decide who lies outside of whiteness and who gets access to it. Among those rights and privileges is the right to control the legal meaning of group identity, and that is what the white power structure does. Look at how it does this in the form of the national census, right? This is not something indigenous nations came up with and control and set the categories for. So in those kinds of tabulations of race and population, you see the control of the white settler power structure defining identity, not only their own, but the identities of others whose racialization and subordination is other, Harris pointed out, is necessary to solidify those parameters and the benefits of whiteness. Okay, so that's what I mean by whiteness as property. I know it's complicated, but I think I bring it up in subsequent slides. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit of a history. This is a really interesting book, Playing Indian by Phil Deloria. First published in 1998. It has since been reissued, I think, with a new preface. Phil Deloria is a Dakota historian from among one of the nations related to my people. He's currently at Harvard in the Department of History. And so I'll just quote from him first and then talk about this. This is a quote from that book. The indeterminacy of American identity stems in part from the nation's inability to deal with Indian people. Americans wanted to feel natural affinity with the continent, and it was Indians who could teach them such aboriginal closeness. Yet in order to control the landscape, they had to destroy the original inhabitants. Half-articulated Indianness continuously lurks behind various efforts at American self-imagination. I would argue that it is very similar in Canada as well. So what he does in that book, by going through many case studies from the Boston Tea Party to these fraternal orders of the 19th century, you know, the red men and these white wealthy settlers forming clubs and dressing up as Indians, not saying that they were actually native people, but dressing up like that. We have the scouting, the Scouts and the Girl Scouts in the early part of the 19th century or 20th century, dressing up as Indians. We have the New Age movement in the 1980s. He goes through all these iterations of playing Indian and dressing up as Indian in this book. He kind of stops at the era of pretendianism or self-indigenization, which I think was in 1998 would have been a very difficult thing to write as a chapter into that book. But he gives us the historical scaffolding to understand how this is not entirely a new phenomenon, that in fact, the ground has been laid since the 18th century for the kind of tidal wave of pretendianism that we are seeing today. And there are two reasons that he identifies that other scholars in anthropology and history have also treated in their writing and research on this work. The first reason is access to resources. The settler state and its citizens are relentlessly trying to appropriate indigenous resources, land, minerals for mining, water and water rights, now are quote unquote identities or representations of us, resources related to employment, academic opportunities, etc. And the second reason is to alleviate a sense of cultural emptiness. And he traces this back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. You go from the assimilation kind of era of the settler state into this sort of civil rights movement, ethnic pride. And there is this sense that whiteness is no longer the goal, but rather something that's even while it continues to confer benefits, it's becoming something of a spiritual or cultural burden. It's got a sense of emptiness around it. And so here are two reasons that we get to this tidal wave of pretendianism that we have today. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to get into some case studies now, and this is an academic case study. We do have a lot of this in academia, but we also have it in the arts. I'll have case studies in that later. We've got politics, the Elizabeth Warren case in the United States. I don't get into that here today. We have had a breaking story in the LA Times in 2019 of people posing as Cherokee who were trying to get small business grants and set-asides in the United States. So not only taking resources away from indigenous entrepreneurs, but actually also appropriating those resources from other minoritized communities in the United States, because those small business incentives were set aside for different minority groups, not only Native people. So this happens across sectors. We've seen in Eastern Canada, of course, stories breaking about people calling themselves Eastern Métis, wanting access to fishing rights and land rights. So let's just look at Andrea Smith for a couple of minutes. Andrea Smith was probably the biggest academic case so far to happen in the US. at the time that she was unmasked as a pretendian, was probably the most widely cited quote unquote indigenous feminist in US academia. So in 2015, I and 13 other US based Native women feminists, all of us enrolled in federally recognized tribes in the US, we were very careful about who signed this letter. And we were all tenured Native women in the academy. We wrote an open letter to the national Native news source, Indian Country Today, explaining that Andrea Smith, who was at the University of California, Riverside, had long been claimed of falsely claiming Cherokee identity. Inside Higher Ed picked up the story. Not much happened in 2015, though, and in fact, she had been called out by Cherokee commentators as early as 2008 in that same paper, Indian Country Today, and nothing had happened. So finally, in 2021, what you see here is a visual from a New York Times Magazine article. This is a long form article where a white woman, great article, a great writer, did a story on Andrea Smith. So it took an article appearing by a white woman in the New York Times before anything really happened. Because who's going to listen to 14 tenured Native American academics or the Cherokee people that had called her out before that? And so this is one of the quotes that she gave early on. She has never really changed, I think, or issued a follow-up statement to the one she first issued in 2016, saying, I have always been and will always be Cherokee. I have consistently identified myself based on what I knew to be true. My enrollment status does not impact my Cherokee identity or my continued commitment to organizing for justice in Native communities. That reference to enrollment status is a distraction. Everybody knew she was not enrolled. That was never the charge being placed against her. Well, you're not enrolled, therefore you shouldn't identify. The charge was that she had zero Cherokee genealogical ancestry. That was the charge. And so this is something you often see in these cases. The people that are accused of making false or exaggerated claims will come back with a defense that is not capturing what the actual charge is. And what they're doing is they're articulating a defense that's relying on these big narratives we have in the academy and in the public about how colonial enrollment status is, how colonial blood quantum is, right? And so they're attempting to distract from the actual case being argued by citing these dominant sort of narratives that we get caught up in. Okay, try to think if there's anything else I want to say about this one. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. And this is Joseph Boyden, who probably all of you in the audience will know about. This case broke in 2017, originally with the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and was picked up by CBC and other outlets. And so Joseph Boyden says something in this quote when he's responding to a question by the late Candy Palmater, who interviewed him. And when she asked him straight out on CBC, are you, I guess it's 2016 this case broke, are you Indigenous? And he says, absolutely. I'm the person I've always shown myself to be, both privately and in public. And my family says I'm a white kid from Willowdale with Native roots. I have always said very clearly and carefully to the public, a small part of me is Indigenous, but it's a big part of who I am. My family has always had our stories from the beginning of my father and his brothers, his Indian brother Earl, and how they had to protect each other and hide that Indian blood. So this is a dominant narrative that self-indigenizers have, that they've been hiding in plain sight, fetishizing an alleged, not confirmed, long ago ancestor that was Indigenous, sometimes named, sometimes not named. We saw in the case of Michelle Latimer, filmmaker Michelle Latimer, I won't get into that case today, but she was invoking an ancestor from the mid-17th century, like many French settlers in Quebec have. That's established through the genealogical research that there are Indigenous women back 350 years ago or however long ago. And so these kinds of narratives are pretty standard. And reliance on those narratives, reliance on a family story. And so it's really interesting to see individuals invoke only bones in the ground, right? This is an individualist kind of property claim, going back to that whiteness as property, right? I own the property of this identity, my ancestry, my genealogy, not an articulation of belonging to or having living relatives that are among Indigenous people. It's an invocation of dead ancestors. Let's go to the next slide. Very common. Just more on Joseph Boyd and more on his statement about his identity, I guess he would probably say. This has been an ongoing search for not just me, but for all of my family all our life. And we've looked for the roots that the stories tell, and you can't sometimes just rely on the written records. Another common narrative, all the records, in courthouses burned up. In fact, settlers are really great at documenting their genealogies, and they have been really good at documenting Indians or Indigenous people as well, because they needed to document us in order for all of their governmental institutions to manage us, to corral us on reserves or reservations in the US, right? To put our children into residential schools. So really great at the record keeping, but this is a dominant narrative. The records are missing. This is a story about my identity and my lifelong search for that identity, and my family's stories have always compelled me and other members of my family to continue this search. Again, invoking stories and not living communities, right? And being socialized and grown within living Indigenous communities. And this was also a story on can't see who wrote that, but Canada Land did this podcast, actually. Joseph Boyd Won't Find Indigenous Identity in a Test Tube of Spit. I could talk about that. I may have been interviewed for that. I can't remember. I've done so many interviews on DNA and Indigenous ancestry claims. And that's, in fact, how I came to be involved in commenting on this topic. I did not set out to research this topic. This is not what I wanted to do with my career the last 5 to 7 years that I've been doing it. But I kept getting called by the media because of the 2013 book I published on Indigenous DNA research in the academy and by DNA testing companies. And I was arguing in that book about why DNA is not definitive proof of Indigenous belonging. And so that's how I come to know about all these cases and began to be compelled to study them so I could spot the patterns in them. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a case you'll know very well in this Zoom room if you're UBC people. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond. So in the years since Smith and Boyden's exposés, there have been many more high-profile self-indigenization cases that have broken in the US and Canada in academia, as I've said, in the minority small business world, in arts, and have also involved entire groups. This isn't just an individual problem, but entire groups posing as Indigenous nations, and there are more exposés coming. I just did an interview on one this weekend of one that just broke in South Dakota this last week. So earlier in 2022, I was interviewed for a story that would become one of the most scandalous self-indigenization cases in Canada. On October 12th, 2022, CBC investigative reporter Jeff Leo, who also broke the Carrie Bourassa and Buffy St. Marie stories, broke the story of this prominent academic, formerly touted as a possible Canadian Supreme Court candidate, and who had made decades of unverifiable claims to have Cree ancestry and federal Indian status. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, sometimes referred to her acronym, her initials acronym METL, METL, was then a professor at UBC School of Law and claimed affiliation with the Norway House Cree Nation in Manitoba through her father. But Jeff Leo wrote for the CBC, Turpel-Lafond is considered to be one of the most accomplished and decorated Indigenous scholars in Canadian history. In 1994, she had been named one of Time magazine's Global 100 leaders for her role in Canada's constitutional debates and for promoting inclusivity and restorative justice in the legal system. After being appointed judge of a provincial court in Saskatchewan in 1998, Turpel-Lafond claimed to be, quote, the first treaty Indian to be appointed to the court. In 2021, she received one of the highest national honors, the Order of Canada. She was widely held to be an advocate and defender of children and youth in state care and was appointed director of UBC's Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. Although she was regularly held up by the settler power structure as a most excellent Indian, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond was quoted in a 1995 article in the Ottawa Citizen as being, quote, proud that she did not get ahead through affirmative action programs for Natives, unquote. However, CBC found documentation that Turpel-Lafond had been targeted as an Aboriginal hire for the Dalhousie School position she took up in 1989. Her high-profile reputation and the accolades heaped upon her It is clear from the record, were not only due to career accomplishments. Her star power was fed by the energy of her story of overcoming an allegedly tragic upbringing within a First Nation community. In remarks made at Meadows' 2014 McGill University honorary doctorate ceremonies, she was described as having grown up, quote, in poverty in Norway House, Manitoba. As a child, she was surrounded by domestic violence, but she lived her own life at a furious pace, urging other marginalized women to become the masters of their own destiny, unquote. A 2007 Globe and Mail article had deployed similar Native stereotypes. Turpel Lafond was described as, quote, surrounded by domestic violence and alcoholism in her home, unquote. A 2005 magazine article stated that, quote, like so many Native homes, hers was rife with alcoholism, poverty, and violence. She regularly witnessed her father striking her mother and suffered abuse herself, unquote. And yet another 1998 magazine article added charges of sexual abuse to the poverty, violence, and alcoholism she allegedly experienced in her home. So here we have a narrative constructed in multiple mainstream Canadian media outlets of an abusive Cree man terrorizing his white wife and their children as the crumbling Indigenous foundations from which Turpel Lafond allegedly rises to prominence. This is a classic Canadian white nationalist narrative with Mary Ellen Turpel Lafond seen by Canadian media as its literal embodiment. The virtuous white-coated inheritor, now protector of Native children, is seen as overcoming the limitations of impoverished, violent, alcoholic, but connected to place Indians. How fitting then that she becomes head of an institute at UBC designed to steward records for and about residential school survivors who were incarcerated as children, assimilated as a resource to build Canadian wealth and authority. After CBC received tips from those who questioned Turpel Lafond's claims to Cree ancestry, Jeff Leo began investigating, and he found that whispers had been circulating since the 1990s that she was not actually Cree. CBC examined records from archives across Canada, including genealogical records, census forms, voter registries. These are the kinds of documents that are regularly investigated in these breaking stories. As is often the case in these investigations, Turpel Lafond herself declined repeated requests for an interview and refused to share any, quote, private, confidential, personal records. But CBC already had access to a vast archive. So what they actually found is in these bullet points on this slide, and I think I'm going to move on to the last case before I go through them all. You know, you may be familiar with what they found. She was born in Niagara Falls. They have pretty good very good records of who her genealogical relatives are. Her adoption stories or her story of on which line and how her ancestry alleged Cree ancestry came down to her changes. This is a common pattern in these stories. If people have one line proven to not have the ancestry they've claimed, they'll shift to another line or to another story. Very common. Okay, you've moved on to the next slide. Thank you. So back to the other one. Thank you. I'm not at Buffy yet. So I just want to say something really quick about the DNA test. Professor Simon Gravel, you can read along on this slide, of the McGill Genome Center was given test results that he was told were Mary Ellen Turpel Lafond's, but he had to take their word at it because there was no identifying evidence that they were actually her results. But, taking it on good faith that they were her results. Here's what he said. The DNA test report that he was given indicated, quote, this is interesting, substantial ancestry from the Americas, despite all the genealogical evidence. And while he knew the specific percentage of that ancestry from the Americas, he was not permitted to share that number publicly. All of the numbers that together, I think, comprise that percentage. But then very strangely, he also admitted that the overall percentage in those results was 25%. Professor Gravel also told CBC he did not verify whether this report is from Turpel Lafond. This is something that the people who gave it to him are claiming. And Gravel then clarified, if the question was, does this person have Indigenous ancestry from populations in Canada from 2 generations ago? I could not say that with any level of confidence from this test. So the main point, people that are educated on indigenous ancestry and genealogy and patterns in that, and who also understand indigenous DNA tests and the numbers and the methods involved in that. You need people who understand both to look at the intersections of the test and the genealogy. And it's very few people that understand both. So I just want to say really quickly that the genetic ancestry indicated in her DNA test, if it is hers, could link her through a narrow genetic line to a long ago unnamed ancestor who may have lived or belonged somewhere among hundreds or even thousands of founding populations in the American continents. But those genetic markers that were looked at, and there were, I think, maybe 8 to 11 indigenous groups that were sampled, but not heavily sampled, a relatively few number of people in those indigenous groups. And so that was the reference data set, right? And so they could say, okay, she has markers that are shared by some people in these 8 or more indigenous samples. But again, there are hundreds or thousands of indigenous peoples across the Americas. And these markers would also be held in varying percentages among indigenous peoples across the Americas. So-called indigenous markers in science are not found only in one or a few specific indigenous populations, because indigenous people are genetically related across the continent. She also would not release the test results, so we don't know definitively that they're hers, and we don't know the fine-grained details that we would need to ask informed questions about possible scenarios in her family tree that might have led to an indigenous ancestry result when the genealogical evidence does not show a relationship to Cree people, including at Norway House. So much more to say about that, but I'm going to be out of time in a few minutes and we're going to get to Q&A. So let's just go through the last case study. Buffy Sainte-Marie. I think most of you also know about this one. This broke in October 2023 on CBC's television show, The Fifth Estate. So Buffy Sainte-Marie, since making the cover of Billboard magazine in 1964, was for all those decades arguably the most famous Indigenous or Native American musician in both Canada and the US. So this was, of course, a hard pill to swallow. I will say, especially in Canada, where her fame, I would say, was much greater across the generations. I think in the US, it tended to be older people like myself and older who would have known about her as she rose to fame in the 1960s and 70s. But this was, I have never witnessed around a Pretendian case the kind of grief, denial, and defensiveness that I witnessed around the Buffy Sainte-Marie case in Canada in 2023. And again, the CBC found that despite her claims of being adopted, various shifting claims, and in one scenario, her mother died in childbirth, I think. In another scenario, she was willfully, or she was scooped. But the documents that they found showed otherwise. And again, she had claims to those documents not being cracked or not being available, not having a birth certificate, but her birth certificate was found in a suburban Boston courthouse. And so CBC goes into all of that in this expose. So fast forward about a year and a half after that expose happened, and media outlets in Canada and the US ran stories on Buffy Sainte-Marie's Order of Canada being terminated by the Governor General. So 16 months after her unmasking, I think many viewers did come to accept the facts uncovered in the 2023 story about her life and her genealogy. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the critiques that has been made, and I think this is an important point, is that, but it's one that can be responded to, that there's been too much focus on individual cases and calling people out, and not enough focus on institutional reform. And you at UBC, like many universities across Canada, are at a point where you're trying to consider what institutional reform looks like. And so I've just got some of these breaking cases that I think have helped get us to institutional reform. And I've got a quote by Jacqueline Keeler. somebody who has taken a lot of heat for her early investigations into pretendianism with the alleged pretendians list that she has been the face of, but she is by no means the only person responsible for gathering data that has supported that list and what it has revealed. Jacqueline Keeler said something really interesting on X a couple of years ago, that the alleged pretendian list began as an accumulation of all the community-based concerns that Native people have about professional ethnic fraudsters. It was a group effort inspired by the hashtag #MeToo media list from several years ago. And if you will remember, those Me Too lists were released by primarily women who had been speaking within institutions, including academic institutions, for a long time about chronic sexual harassers. Or people that had committed sexual assault and were not responded to, and they finally started publishing lists with names and incidents. And so Jacqueline Keeler talked about how that's those kinds of lists and crowdsourcing of data and public calling out of harassment were what inspired the alleged pretendian list. And I will have to say about that list, about the Ghost Warrior Society in Canada, and about the Tribal Alliance Against Fraud, which had compiled the data that resulted in the Thomas King case being broken a couple of weeks ago. Those groups tend to, from what I can tell, and I know some people behind the scenes, but not all of them, because I don't go, asking for rosters of names. They tend to be led by women, by Indigenous women. A lot of the people in community that are calling out this problem and that are attempting to whistleblow behind the scenes and that have suffered the backlash of critique, a lot of them have been Indigenous women. And remember, as I said in that 2015 letter to Indian Country Today, we were a group of tenured Indigenous women academics who wrote that letter. We went through a lot of online abuse after that. So what I have learned in all of this is Indigenous women take a lot of heat for getting these stories out into the public eye. But I am really encouraged by where we are 10 years after I really started, maybe 15 years after I started doing this work, because I first got called about Elizabeth Warren's ancestry and DNA back in 2012. That's when I first started having to think about this stuff. I think we've come a long way to where we're at a place where we're thinking about institutional reform. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And I don't know what Zoom's filtering out, but I have clanky, loud pipes behind me. So that's what you're hearing, if you can hear that. Okay, so my point being, breaking cases got us to policy reform. And we got to breaking cases because of the behind the scenes work of Indigenous women that is not always viewed as respectable, not always viewed as professional. It's not respectable academics, that primarily did this work. It's women and people in community who have taken a lot of heat, taken a lot of grief, and have really suffered a lot of backlash. But here we are at institutional policy reform, at least in Canada. We're not quite there in the US yet. I think we're a bit behind. And as I've said elsewhere, we're not behind in the US because Canada has better settler colonists. I think it's because in Canada, Indigenous people are hypervisible. And that has both negative and sometimes positive consequences. And in the US, we are what Kevin Brunel calls, we suffer settler memory, meaning settlers invoke us as part of the past. And not only settlers, but other non-Indigenous US citizens are really capable of invoking us as part of the past, but they're not capable of seeing us as politically relevant in the present. And that's what he calls settler memory. So let's go to the next slide. So I do give shout outs to media. I'm going to stop here. So I've got a lot of slides on policies, but here's some kind of grounding principles or teachings that we've seen in some of the policies that have emerged across Canada. We know we need to go beyond self-identification. We're talking about Indigenous self-determination, not equity, diversity, and inclusion. We want to avoid additional barriers and harms, and these are some of the questions that are going to come up about this. We want truth and transparency. We want to uphold the integrity of Indigenous spaces, knowledges, epistemologies, and citizenship. We need to be concerned about data privacy and protection of personal information as Indigenous substantiation or verification is achieved. And we want to think about the consequences for fraudulent claims. If there are no consequences, will we be able to stem the tide? So I will go to my next slide, which is acknowledgements, and we can open it up for Q&A, I think.
Thanks so much, Kim. My name is Caroline Harvey. I work with the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives, and I'll be supporting the Q&A. So thank you to everyone that submitted a question. We'll just jump right into it. The first question is, how do we balance the issues of requiring citizenship, such as proof of government identification, with people's experience of losing status, being disenfranchised, and disconnected from community, i.e. the 60s scoop? And how can these policies account for the nuance of experiences with Indigenous identity when verifying citizenship, so as not to cause more harm or trauma, particularly for young people, such as students, or for those reconnecting or healing from intergenerational trauma, harm, and disconnection?
Yeah, I think that's a question that always comes up when I give these talks. And I think what you will find in your institution, and I know you're going to have other speakers in who have kind of dealt with these policy development at other universities. Universities are going to find out that that's going to be a question that really drives how they're doing the verification of students in particular, right? And so what I've seen on the committees I've sat on is a real sense of care. But I was lucky, I was at the University of Alberta, where there are a lot of actual Indigenous staff members and faculty members, and they may not think it's good enough, but pretty good networks out among Indigenous community. You have staff and faculty that work really closely with students that are really thinking a lot about those issues in the implementation. And so, for example, I've seen student advocates within the University of Alberta actually discover that they were able to help students who did see themselves as disconnected reconnect and do the paperwork they needed to do to say, apply for Métis Nation of Alberta or whatever. So students who may not have had families who were helping them maintain those connections were able to hopefully find some of that within the university. So UBC will find that they will need people who are skilled at helping students navigate that. And there's an opportunity in that as they do reconnect to official organizations, right? And as they come together to see that other people have sort of gone on this path before and they're not alone. There are other people who have this experience that can help guide them. So you do need those experts within your institution to help guide that. There's not going to be a simple policy that's going to take care of this, is my point. You're going to need the people to help do that work.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what's your take on people who claim an Indigenous identity based on having a distant Indigenous ancestor and nothing more to contribute to this claim? So, for example, and you touched on this a bit during your talk, folks that learn of potential Indigenous ancestry from Ancestry.com or other DNA tests.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, right? All of us probably in this Zoom room have ancestry from different parts of the world. And that's interesting. But when you're talking about an Indigenous collective, right, a people with an ongoing culture and ongoing claims to territory and ongoing sets of relatives and relationships, that is that's who you belong to. That's a sense of belonging versus somebody like Joseph Boyden, who may or may not have an ancestor in the ground several hundred years ago. Michelle Latimer, who apparently has an ancestor in the ground several hundred years ago. That's interesting. But when you come from a family that is related to multiple families and ancestors, and you see how these family trees branch out, you have to, if you have one Indigenous ancestor, even an actual one among 1,000 European descent ancestors, how have you been raised? You've been raised in generation after generation of people whose lives are, even if who benefited from the displacement of Indigenous people and whose lives on these lands are made possible by the disenfranchisement and theft from Indigenous people. Why would we accept that one ancestor as a claim to belonging to us when they have 1,000 other ancestors who, and we can get into structural versus individual kinds of will here, but who structurally benefited, if not individually committed those kinds of acts against Indigenous people? So I don't think whether there's a real ancestor or not, I don't think it really matters if you're going back that kind of generation. If you're not somebody who can connect to living relatives, I think that's the standard that we're going to see coming out of all this? Can you connect to living relatives, to a living community who remembers you or your parents and can reclaim you back? Dead bones in the ground from 300 years ago is an interesting story. They can't claim you, and that's not a community.
Great, thank you. This next question is from one of the attendees, and it starts as the politics of Métis identity in Canada is a particular place of contention where pretendians might find it easier to hide. What advice or best practices do you recommend for questions about Métis identity in Canada? How should an academic institution wade through the politics, and who should they be listening to?
I mean, I think a Métis speaker that you have is gonna do a better job at answering this question, I will say. But it's a broader question for all of us. Universities need strong networks in order to co-govern, right? They need strong networks out in Indigenous communities in what we would call Indian country in the US. So if you're going to do good policy, you have to, at the same time, be developing those networks if you don't already have them. And some universities are better than others because you can't rely on the individual expertise of academics within the institution to decide alone. First of all, it's too much of a burden on us, right? We already have what some people have called a minority tax. We have all this additional work to do because there are so few of us, right? To make this a place that will welcome and be a good place for Indigenous people. So we can't be expected to fully take on that extra burden. And anyway, it's the First Nations, it's Métis nations, it's those kinds of communities that should be helping do that work. And that means the university has got to develop those relationships, right? They need to draw on those experts and multiple different institutions. And once you build your network in a field, you begin to recognize who are the legit people, who are the smart people, who are the people I can trust and listen to. And you only know who to trust and listen to by developing those networks. If you don't have them, then you're not going to be in a good position to judge anybody's expertise, I think.
Definitely. And just wish to thank the attendees that did submit questions regarding Métis identity. I can confirm that we are planning on ensuring that there are Métis speakers that can speak to this topic at a future webinar that we'll offer. In terms of the next question, it goes, how can Indigenous teams responsible for developing and implementing memberships and citizenship verification policies effectively communicate to the broader university community that these policies are solely about verification? Specifically, how do we make clear that the responsibility for adapting services, processes, and compliance lies with individual units and the institution, not solely with the Indigenous policy team?
The last sentence of that question was,
how do we make clear that the responsibility for adapting services, processes, and compliance lies with individual units and the institution, not solely with the Indigenous policy team?
I mean, that sounds like a question that the answer is you have to have those ongoing conversations with them. I haven't had an experience. This person might be deeper into this than deeper into the administrative development of policy than I have been. But again, I think we're going back to those relationships with community. And I will also say it's not only Indigenous people that have been involved in these. You've got lawyers and people with the unions, right? You've got those kinds of experts who need to make sure that you're finding ways to make space within the institutional policies for these new kinds of policies dealing with Indigenous verification. So, yeah, I'm not sure I can totally answer that question, other than, of course, it's not. I feel like I maybe have already answered it by talking about developing those kinds of networks, right? And that's not only the job of the Indigenous, vice provost Indigenous. It's not only their job, right? It's not the job of Indigenous or Native studies, right? This is the job of decision makers throughout the university to be developing those kinds of networks. So I think maybe there's an assumption that because this is Indigenous content, so it's our job, but this is in fact not Indigenous content. This is settler content. This is the problem of the settler state and their citizens. We are not making this problem, right? And while we are called on to help solve it, non-Indigenous people have as much or more responsibility to help solve the problem. And that first step is to be willing to develop the kinds of relationships that they need to, right? This isn't just, we already have those relationships. They need to develop them.
Great. Thank you. Um, I have another question here. It is, what are your thoughts about people who have been confronted with their own genealogy and continue to affirm their Indigenous identity? Also, should there be a law in Canada that prohibits those with fraudulent identity claims?
I don't know what that second part of the question is, a law that prohibits them. I don't know what prohibits them from.
Claiming Indigenous identity.
Oh, I'm going to let a lawyer answer that. I don't know. I don't know what that would look like. And the first part of the question was when people persist in the face of all evidence. That's what they do. They do persist in the face of all evidence. I personally would never argue that one-on-one. I think we get these policies in place, and I think we have to focus on, what are the barriers to being able to profit off those claims. So somebody individually, and I think a lot of the language in these policies across the country does this, it will say something like, and this is where you see the influence of the lawyers. You can identify any way you want as an individual. What we are doing is verifying the claims to Indigenous community that you are making if you are going to use those claims to, say, apply for an Indigenous priority position or a scholarship reserved for Indigenous people, right? We're simply verifying the claims that you have made. We're not telling you how to identify or not identify. So they make a real distinction between verification of claims and verification of identity. And you see that very careful language in these policies. And so an attorney could better answer that question than me. But I think that's really, I think that's good. I personally don't, would not sit there and get into some deep argument with somebody. But I would rather move into that other territory of what can we actually do about it, and from a policy perspective.
Great. Thank you so much. In terms of sort of a closing question, as UBC embarks on our engagement process for the Indigenous Citizenship Declaration Policy, those engagement sessions will help inform the policy that will eventually be drafted and written. What kind of advice do you have for a university at this stage? Is there any sort of messages that you wish to share with our institution so that we can start this work in a good way?
I did. I did hear, if I can say, that UBC is going to try to tackle the international Indigenous question. And I do know that that's something that other institutions have approached and decided. There are some institutions that have said we're going to really focus on not Indigenous claims, but First Nation, Métis, and Inuit claims, for example. Other institutions have said, we know we have cross-border peoples where we are. We're going to focus on those recognized groups in Canada and recognized groups in the US. It is, I will say, taking on the question of international indigeneity is laudable. I have no idea how that's going to go. I can understand why an institution would think that it needs to do that and should do that, that perhaps it has more global indigeneity within its ranks than some other institutions that might primarily have, First Nations, Métis, and or Inuit. So I'm interested to see how UBC does that. I don't think it'll be easy, but I think it's going to go back to that principle of co-governance. And if UBC is going to take that on internationally, then they've got a big job ahead of them, which is networking with recognized Indigenous groups and organizations internationally. And so I'll just point you to something that just was issued, the Indigenous Journalists Association Indigenous Identity Reporting Guide. And it's available online, and it actually takes on understanding Indigenous identity globally. And so they have case studies that they highlight from North America, from the Pacific, from Asia, from East Africa, and they talk about different organizations in those parts of the world and so the reporters, I guess, have really thought about, because they're going around the world and reporting globally, they may have more information about what this global landscape looks like. And so I would refer you to that. But I'm impressed that UBC wants to take on that question, and I'm really interested to see what kind of policy you come to after what promises to be a really difficult, challenging, but that's probably good foray into that area.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Yeah.
On behalf of the co-chairs of iSpeak and the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives, we'd just like to extend our thank you to Dr. Kim TallBear for providing this incredible insight for this important matter. Thank you to all the attendees, and a special thank you to those who took the time to submit a question. As mentioned during the introduction, we are excited to share that this webinar is the beginning of a speaker series, and we look forward to sharing information regarding future webinars with you soon. So Chanel, thank you very much and have a great day.